The gymnasium still smelled like floor wax and old varnish, the same smell it had smelled like 20 years earlier. And Daniel Foster was standing near the folding table with the name tags when the double doors at the far end opened and the noise of the room seemed to drop half a step, the way a room does when something in it has changed before anyone can say what. He turned because everyone else had turned, and that was when he saw her. Emily Carter stood in the doorway, in a plain gray coat, with her hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl, maybe 6 or 7, and for a moment Daniel forgot how to hold his own drink, because the last time he had seen that face, it had been 20 years younger, and laughing at something he'd said in a hallway that no longer existed in the building the way it once had. Someone near him murmured that they'd heard she'd lost her husband that spring, a rancher out near the county line. Sudden, a heart that gave out in a field with no one close enough to help, and Daniel felt something in his chest tighten the way a rope tightens when weight is suddenly put on it. Emily's eyes moved across the room and found him, and she went still, one hand still on her daughter's shoulder, and for 3 full seconds neither of them moved at all, the whole gymnasium blurring around the edges of that stillness. Then the little girl broke free of her mother's hand and walked straight across the gym floor, weaving between folding chairs and old classmates who didn't matter to her at all, until she stopped in front of Daniel and looked up at him with an unhurried, searching kind of certainty that a 7-year-old has no business having, and wrapped both arms around his waist before he could say a single word. He froze, his glass of punch nearly slipping from his hand, and above the girl's head he saw Emily's mouth open and then close again, no sound coming out. The girl tipped her head back and looked up at him and said it plainly, the way children say the truest things, without any sense that the words might land like a struck bell in a grown man's chest. "Mommy said you'd come." To find out how a girl who had never met him could say those words with such certainty, and what Emily Carter had never told her daughter about a boy from 20 years ago, stay until the very end. If stories like this one feel familiar to you, if you have ever watched someone come back into a room and felt the years fold up like a letter being put back in its envelope, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves, and this channel exists because of the way you share those stories with us. There is an old argument that never quite settles in towns like the one Daniel grew up in, about whether a person who stays quiet about their feelings for 20 years is protecting the people they love, or simply protecting themselves from ever being told no. And Daniel's own mother used to say that a man who never searches his heart has no right to complain when someone else claims it first, and that question would follow him through everything that came after. 20 years earlier, none of what happened in that gymnasium had happened yet, and Daniel Foster was 17 years old and quietly, hopelessly in love with a girl who sat 2 rows ahead of him in third period English and never seemed to notice the way he watched the back of her head. Emily Carter was the kind of girl who was kind to everyone without meaning to be remarkable about it, who helped freshmen find their lockers and remembered the names of the janitorial staff, and Daniel had written her exactly 11 letters over the course of 2 years, folded them into careful squares, and delivered none of them, because his father was dying slowly of a lung disease that ate away at him one winter at a time, and Daniel had made a private decision that a boy with a sick father and no money had no business asking a girl like Emily Carter to wait around for him. He told himself it was practical. He told himself there would be time later. There was not. Emily's family moved to be closer to her mother's people the summer after graduation, and by the time Daniel worked up the nerve to write a 12th letter, the address he had for her no longer existed, and the 11 letters he had written went into a cedar box in his closet instead of into her hands, and stayed there for 2 decades while Daniel built a small, quiet life around them without ever quite deciding to. He became a carpenter, not by any grand plan, but because his father had taught him to frame a wall and true a door frame before he had taught him almost anything else, and after his father died, Daniel simply kept doing the thing his hands already knew how to do. He ran a one-man restoration business out of a truck with faded lettering on the door, repairing barns and porches and the bones of old houses that everyone else in the county had given up on, and he did the work with a precision that made the older tradesmen in town nod at him with a respect they rarely gave to anyone under 50. he never married. There had been a woman, once, for almost 3 years, and it had ended quietly and without much bitterness. Because Daniel, if he was honest with himself in the dark of his own kitchen, had never fully arrived in that relationship. Some part of him, always standing a little apart, waiting for a version of his life that had never come. Emily's life, in those same 20 years, had taken a harder shape than anyone at the reunion would have guessed from the calm way she carried herself. She had married a rancher named Thomas Carter, a good man by every account, steady and broad-shouldered and devoted to the 2,000 acres of grazing land his own grandfather had cleared by hand. And for 11 years they had built something together, a life measured in calving seasons and hay counts, and the particular light that falls across a ranch house porch at the end of a long day. Lily had come along 7 years into the marriage, a late and cherished surprise, and for a while it had seemed to Emily that the hardest parts of her life were already behind her. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, Thomas had gone out to check a fence line on the north pasture and simply never come back on his feet, his heart stopping somewhere in that empty field, with no one near enough to hear him fall. And Emily had spent the spring learning the particular arithmetic of grief, the way it shows up first in silence and then in paperwork. By the time of the reunion, Emily was 6 months into widowhood and drowning, quietly and without complaint, under a mountain of debt she had not known existed until Thomas's death forced it into daylight. The ranch, it turned out, had been mortgaged twice against equipment purchases in years of drought, and a land investment firm out of the county seat, run by a smooth, sharp-suited man named Grant Whitfield, had already sent 2 letters expressing interest in relieving her of the burden. Letters that used words like opportunity and closure, and never once used the word home. Emily had come to the reunion that night, mostly because Lily had begged her to get out of the house for one evening, and she had not expected, walking through those double doors, to feel 20 years fall away in an instant at the sight of a quiet man standing near a folding table, holding a cup of punch he had forgotten he was drinking. 3 years would not need to pass before Emily's carefully guarded composure began to crack in front of him. It would take only 3 days, and a phone call about a letter from Grant Whitfield's office, for everything Emily had been holding together alone to come apart in front of the one man who had never stopped watching the back of her head. The reunion ended the way reunions do, with promises to keep in touch that both people half meant and half doubted, and Daniel walked Emily and Lily out to their truck under a sky gone the color of a bruise. The conversation between the 2 adults, careful and formal, in a way that neither of them wanted, both of them talking around the 20 years between them instead of through them. Lily fell asleep in the back seat before they even left the parking lot, worn out from an evening of introducing herself to strangers as if she had known them all her life. And Emily stood by the driver's door for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at Daniel in the orange wash of the parking lot light, and said only that it had been good to see him, that she had thought about him more than she probably should have over the years. And then she got in the truck and drove away before either of them could turn that sentence into something neither of them was ready for. 3 days later, Daniel got a call, not from Emily, but from Walt Higgins, an old family friend of the Carters who still helped out around the ranch on weekends. A man who had known Daniel's father and trusted Daniel's hands with anything that needed fixing. Walt said that Emily needed help, real help, that Grant Whitfield's firm had come back with a formal offer on the ranch, low enough to be almost insulting, wrapped in language about market conditions and liability that Emily, grieving and exhausted and unfamiliar with the fine print of land deals, did not have the energy left to fight. Daniel drove out to the ranch that same afternoon without calling ahead, a decision he would later understand was both the right instinct and the wrong approach. Because when he arrived, Emily was standing in the yard with Grant Whitfield himself, a man in a pressed shirt and expensive boots that had never once stood in actual mud, and the conversation Daniel walked into was already tilted against her. Grant looked Daniel up and down in the particular way that certain men look at other men who work with their hands, a glance that priced him instantly and dismissively, and when Daniel offered, plainly and without flourish, to look at the ranch's structural problems himself before Emily signed anything, Grant let out a short laugh that was not unkind exactly, but was worse than unkind. because it was careless. He said, in front of Emily and in front of Walt, that this was a 7-figure liability situation involving engineering reports and county inspectors, not something that got solved with a hammer and good intentions, and that Emily owed it to her daughter to take a serious offer from serious people rather than lean on the sentimental gesture of an old high school friend playing handyman. Emily did not defend Daniel in that moment. She was too tired, too raw, too many months deep into the particular exhaustion of being the only adult left to make every decision, and she said nothing at all while Grant's words hung in the yard. And Daniel, who had never in his life raised his voice at another man, simply nodded once, said that he understood, and got back in his truck. He did not go back to the ranch after that. For nearly 6 weeks, Daniel told himself that Grant Whitfield had been right, that a woman rebuilding her life after losing her husband did not need an old flame showing up uninvited with a toolbox and old feelings dressed up as help, and that whatever had flickered back to life in that gymnasium had been foolish to trust. He buried himself in other jobs, reroofed a church hall 2 towns over, reframing a porch for a retired schoolteacher, and told anyone who asked that he was fine, that the reunion had been nice to see old faces, nothing more. Underneath that flat, steady surface, though, something in him had gone quiet in a way that worried even his oldest friends. A stillness that was not his usual calm but something heavier, and late at night he would take the cedar box down from his closet shelf and look at the 11 unsent letters without opening any of them, as if simply holding the weight of them in his hands was its own kind of confession. If you have ever felt dismissed the way Daniel was dismissed that afternoon in the yard, waved off as not serious enough, not credentialed enough, not important, to not be trusted with something that mattered, we would be grateful if you shared that in the comments, because there is real comfort in knowing you are not the only one who has ever felt unseen in a room full of people deciding your worth for you. It is worth asking, and people in town certainly did ask it over coffee in the weeks that followed. Whether a rancher's daughter and a small-town carpenter belonged in the same conversation as a firm with lawyers and appraisers and letters on heavy stationery, whether real responsibility in a crisis like this should rest with the people who had the paperwork to back their confidence, or with the people who actually knew the ground with their own 2 hands, and that question would sit unresolved in the town for a long while yet. Emily, for her part, spent those same 6 weeks slowly drowning in the exact kind of paperwork Grant Whitfield had promised would relieve her burden. Each new document from his firm seemed to reveal another clause she hadn't understood the first time, another fee buried in another appendix, and each night after Lily was asleep, Emily sat at the kitchen table Thomas had built with his own hands and stared at numbers that made less and less sense the longer she looked at them, until sometime near the end of that 6th week, worn thin by grief and math in equal measure, she found herself taking down an old shoebox from the top of her closet, the one she had carried with her through every move in 20 years, without ever quite admitting to herself why, and inside it, still folded into careful squares, were letters of her own, though not the 11 Daniel had written and never sent. These were copies, in her own younger handwriting, of every reply she had drafted to a boy she'd been too shy and too proud to mail first, waiting for a first letter from him that had simply never come. 20 years of 2 people protecting each other from a rejection that neither one had actually offered. And Emily sat with those pages in her lap for a long time before an ordinary Thursday afternoon in early autumn arrived and changed everything neither of them had ever quite said out loud. The Thursday afternoon in question began with nothing more dramatic than a phone call from Walt Higgins, who told Emily, in the careful, apologetic tone of a man delivering bad news he'd rather not carry, that he had run into the county building inspector at the feed store, and the inspector had mentioned, almost in passing, that Grant Whitfield's firm had already filed a preliminary land use application for the north and east pastures, the ones closest to the county road, well before Emily had signed anything at all. It was a small detail, the kind of thing that could be explained away as routine due diligence, except that Emily had specifically asked Grant, twice, whether any part of the offer involved subdividing the grazing land for future development, and both times he had told her, warmly and reassuringly, that the firm's only interest was in preserving the ranch's agricultural character. Sitting at her kitchen table with that shoebox of unsent letters still open in front of her, Emily felt something in her chest go cold and sharp at once. The particular clarity that arrives only after weeks of fog, and she understood, all at once, that she had been managed rather than helped. It was Lily, oddly enough, who pushed the next piece into place, in the unthinking way that children sometimes see straight through to the center of things adults have overcomplicated. Riding home from school that same afternoon, Lily asked her mother, apropos of nothing, why the man in the shiny boots kept coming to their house when Daniel, who she had decided she liked very much, never came anymore. And when Emily tried to explain gently that it was complicated, Lily said, with the flat confidence of a 7-year-old delivering an obvious truth, that Daddy always said you could tell who really cared about the ranch by who showed up when there was work to do, not just when there was a check to write. Emily did not answer her daughter for a long moment, both hands tight on the steering wheel, because the words had landed exactly where a child's honesty tends to land, directly on the thing the adult had been avoiding. That night, after Lily was asleep, Emily drove to Daniel's house for the first time in her life, parking her truck in front of a small, well-kept place with a wrap-around porch that anyone could see had been built and rebuilt by careful hands over many years. And she knocked on his door with a folder of Grant Whitfield's paperwork tucked under one arm, and Walt's information about the land use filing folded inside it. When Daniel opened the door and saw her standing there, he did not say anything about the 6 weeks of silence between them, did not ask why she had come or make her explain herself. He simply stepped back and let her in, and that quiet lack of demand was, Emily would later think, the first real proof she had that Grant Whitfield had been wrong about him from the very beginning. She told him everything, the filing, the buried clauses, the sleepless weeks of feeling managed instead of helped, and somewhere in the middle of it, without entirely planning to, she also told him about the shoebox of unsent replies, 20 years old, that she had never worked up the courage to send. Daniel listened to all of it, without interrupting, and when she finished, he went to his own closet and brought back the cedar box, and set it on the kitchen table between them, 11 folded squares of paper that had waited 2 decades to be read. He offered her, that night, the only thing he actually had to offer, which was not money he didn't have or a title he'd never sought, but his own 2 hands and whatever time it took to go over every structure on the ranch, the barn, the equipment shed, the old well house, and give her an honest count of what was actually failing and what could genuinely be saved. So that whatever decision she made about Grant Whitfield's offer, she would make it with real information instead of borrowed fear. Emily, sitting across the table from a man she had loved silently for 20 years and lost twice through no fault of either of them, asked him plainly what he wanted in return, and Daniel said only that he wanted the truth to matter more than the deal, for her sake and for Lily's, and that he was not interested in being paid to feel useful. He simply wanted to be trusted to help, the way he should have been trusted from the start. The work began the following week, and it did not stay simple for long. Within days of Daniel's first inspection of the north barn, a storm system rolled through the county with a violence the forecasters hadn't fully predicted, dumping several inches of rain in a matter of hours and putting real strain on a roof structure that Daniel had already flagged as compromised. Rot working through the old hand-hewn trusses along the ridgeline, where a decade of minor leaks had gone unaddressed. In the middle of the storm, with Emily and Lily sheltering in the house and Walt Higgins pacing the porch, a section of that ridge beam gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and Daniel, without a second's hesitation, went out into the driving rain to shore up the collapse before the whole roof could come down onto 40 head of cattle huddled inside. He worked for 3 hours in the dark and the wind with a headlamp and a truck full of temporary bracing, and by the time the storm broke, the barn was standing, damaged but saved, and Daniel Foster stood soaked to the skin in the yard, while Emily watched him from the porch with an expression that made Grant Whitfield's careless laugh from 6 weeks earlier feel like it belonged to a different, smaller world entirely. Grant's firm, unaware of any of it, had already set a deadline of 30 days for Emily to accept their offer before it expired, and neither Daniel nor Emily yet knew that the storm damage he had just prevented was about to become the single piece of evidence that would unravel everything Grant Whitfield had been hiding in the fine print of his own paperwork. In the week after the storm, Daniel did something that would have seemed, to anyone who only knew him as a quiet man in a work truck, entirely out of character, though anyone who had watched him work for 20 years would have recognized it instantly as exactly who he was. He documented everything: photographs of the failed ridge beam, samples of the rotted wood, a detailed written account of the temporary repairs he'd made and what permanent work would actually be required, cross-referenced against the original survey the county had on file for the property. And when he laid all of it out on Emily's kitchen table alongside Grant Whitfield's original offer, a pattern emerged that neither of them could have seen clearly before. Grant's firm had commissioned its own private inspection of the ranch months earlier, quietly, before ever approaching Emily, and that inspection, buried in an appendix she had glanced past in her exhaustion, had flagged the exact same structural risk in the north barn that Daniel had just spent a storm-soaked night fighting to save, except Grant's report had used that risk not as a reason to help, but as leverage to lower the offer, all while his firm had simultaneously filed for land use changes on the very pastures surrounding that barn, planning to develop the grazing land the moment the ranch changed hands. Daniel laid this out for Emily plainly, without triumph, in the same steady voice he used to explain a repair estimate, because gloating had never been in his nature, and wasn't about to start now over something this important. He told her only what the documents actually showed, careful not to overstate it, letting the paper speak for itself, the way he'd let his work speak for itself for 20 years of quiet, uncredited craftsmanship around the county. Emily read through it twice, her hands steady in a way they hadn't been in months, and when she finally looked up at him, something in her had visibly settled, the fog of grief and fear and misplaced trust burning away to reveal a clarity that had been buried under all of it since March. She said quietly that she had let a man in expensive boots convince her that competence only came with a firm's letterhead attached to it, and that she owed Daniel an apology she didn't know how to make big enough. And Daniel, in the way that was entirely his own, told her that an apology wasn't what he needed, that what mattered now was making sure Grant Whitfield's firm didn't do to some other widow what it had nearly done to her. There is an old familiar argument in towns built on ranching and farming about whether the people with degrees and glossy reports and confident vocabulary should be trusted over the people who have simply worked a piece of land or a set of tools their whole lives without ever needing a certificate to prove it. And Daniel's story would end up settling that argument, at least in that county, more decisively than anyone expected. Emily brought the documents to a county land use hearing the following week, a hearing that had originally been scheduled as a routine formality to approve the preliminary filing Grant Whitfield's firm had submitted, and instead became something else entirely once Emily stood up, in front of the county commissioners and a scattering of neighbors, and, notably, Grant Whitfield himself, and read aloud, without raising her voice, the exact language from his firm's own private report describing the ranch's structural risk, compared directly against the exact language from the offer letter that claimed the firm's only interest was preserving the ranch's agricultural character. Grant Whitfield, watching his own paperwork read back to him in a public hearing room, did the thing that men like him tend to do when they are cornered by their own words rather than someone else's accusation. He tried first to reframe it as a misunderstanding, then to suggest the documents had been taken out of context, and finally, when a commissioner asked him directly whether the land use filing had in fact preceded any signed agreement with Emily Carter, he had no reframing left available to him at all, and the silence that followed his non-answer said more to the room than any accusation could have. The hearing did not end with Grant Whitfield in handcuffs, because this was not that kind of story, but it ended with the county tabling the land use application indefinitely pending an ethics review, and with Emily Carter walking out of that hearing room for the first time in 6 months, feeling like the ground beneath her actually belonged to her again. Daniel had not said a single word during the hearing itself, standing quietly near the back of the room in a clean shirt that still smelled faintly of the storm 2 weeks earlier, and it would be another month, an ordinary Saturday morning at the start of harvest season, before the whole town would learn just how much of the ranch's survival and Emily's own restored footing, had come from the quiet hands of a man most of them had only ever thought of as the fellow who fixed porches. The town found out the way small towns tend to find things out, gradually and then all at once, through the county newspaper's account of the tabled land use hearing and through Walt Higgins, who told the story at the feed store with the particular relish of a man who had believed in someone all along and finally got to say so out loud. And by the time the county held its annual harvest fair a month later, most everyone in attendance knew some version of what Daniel Foster had done for Emily Carter's ranch, even if the details had gotten a little larger and a little more dramatic with each retelling. Grant Whitfield's firm quietly withdrew from the county altogether within 2 weeks of the hearing, and Emily received, not long after, a formal written apology from the firm's regional office, along with an offer to fund the full structural restoration of the North Barn, at no cost to her, a gesture that Emily recognized immediately for what it was, an attempt to buy back the firm's reputation rather than a genuine reckoning with what had nearly happened. At the harvest fair, in front of most of the county gathered under the string lights strung between the Grange Hall and the parking lot, the fair committee asked Emily to say a few words as part of the evening's small ceremony honoring local families who had weathered hardship that year. And Emily, standing at a borrowed microphone with Lily's hand in hers, did not talk about grief or loss the way everyone expected her to. She talked instead about the particular kind of blindness that comes from assuming the people with the most confident voices are the ones who deserve the most trust. And she said, looking directly at Daniel standing near the back of the crowd in the same quiet way he always stood in a crowd, that the ranch her husband's family had built by hand over 3 generations was still standing that night because of a man who had never once asked for credit, and had, in fact, tried more than once to avoid taking any. She asked him, in front of everyone, to come up and stand beside her, and Daniel, who had spent 20 years being the kind of man who worked without an audience, walked forward anyway, because some things matter more than a lifetime habit of staying quiet. The fair committee, moved by Emily's words and eager to make a public gesture of their own, offered Daniel a modest cash award and a plaque recognizing him as the county's honored craftsman of the year, the kind of showy recognition that would have looked good pinned above the register of his little shop. And Daniel thanked them sincerely, and then, in the same steady voice he used for everything, declined the cash award and asked instead if the committee would consider funding a small apprenticeship program, one that would pay a modest wage to young people from families like his own who wanted to learn carpentry and restoration work but couldn't afford to work unpaid while they learned, so that the next quiet, capable kid in the county wouldn't have to spend 20 years being overlooked the way he had been. The committee agreed on the spot, and the program that grew out of that single request would go on, in the years that followed, to train a dozen young carpenters who might otherwise never have had the chance. Months later, on an ordinary evening in early winter, Daniel drove out to the ranch not for any repair or emergency, but simply because Emily had asked him to come for dinner, and he found Lily sitting on the porch steps waiting for him with a piece of scrap wood and a dull pocket knife she wasn't quite allowed to use unsupervised, carving, with great concentration, what she informed him was going to be a sign for the front gate. When he asked what it would say, she held it up, unfinished but legible, 3 words carved deep into the grain. The Carter Foster Ranch. Daniel looked at it for a long moment, and then looked past Lily to the porch light, where Emily stood watching them both with an expression that needed no words attached to it at all. And he understood, standing there in the cold evening air with a 7-year-old's crooked carving in his hands, that some letters take 20 years to be delivered, and are worth every day of the wait. If you have ever spent years believing that the people who overlooked you were simply right about your worth, we hope Daniel and Emily's story reminds you that quiet, steady people are so often the ones holding up more than anyone around them realizes, and if you believe, as we do, that overlooked people deserve to be seen for exactly who they are, we would be honored to have you stay part of this family here with us, subscribing, not because a story asks you to, but because you believe these stories are worth telling. A cedar box of unsent letters sat on a closet shelf for 20 years, waiting for someone brave enough to open it, and somewhere tonight, there may be a letter of your own still waiting to be sent. If this story moved you even a little, stay with us, because the final truth of what those 11 letters said is still to come.